Okay, so I am on Google Hangout live with Anthony, and we are going to go through how to write up an offer. So what I would first ask you to do is go and start a new tab, and what I've done is I've saved to my favorites the mykw.kw.com/KW intranet link, just to make it quicker and easier for me. So I click on that tab.
Okay, hang on 1 second.
Okay.
Clicked on that, yeah.
Well, you don't. Yeah, you can just see my screen right now, right, Anthony?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so just follow along looking at my screen, I guess would be the best thing for now while we're recording this video. All right, so what you would do is once you log in here, you go to the top right-hand side where it says My Transactions and click on Messages. And this will bring you to DotLoop. So part of this is not only going to this session is not only showing you how to write up an offer, but it's also teaching you how to use DotLoop in writing up an offer. So it's kind of a two-in-one training session. So what you first want to do is you want to create a loop, and we'll make a test loop. So we'll call it 123 Test Street in Test, Massachusetts. How's that sound? And we're going to create a loop.
Don, I'm going to stop you right there. Sorry to interrupt. It looks like your screen froze.
Just on your end it may look like it's frozen, but on my end it's working, so this will come out good on the video.
Okay.
Okay, so here we are at 123 Test Street in Test, Mass. And what we want to do is we want to add some documents first, and then we'll add some people after that. So what I normally do is I'll go into, let's say, templates, and on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side here, I have some John Miller Real Estate Experts buying forms, and I click all the forms that I would normally use to write up an offer. So we have the contract to purchase, mandatory agency disclosure form, a radon gas and mold notice and waiver form, and then we have the property transfer lead paint form. So I click on those 4 items and I'll click on Add Documents. Now we want to add some people, because when you add people in there they will automatically populate their names into the forms themselves. So on the right hand side where it says you can add a person, the first thing I want to do is I want to change my role as the buyer agent. So that's what you would do. You would change your name to buying agent. Add a person, very simple. You add the name of your person's we'll call this person Testy McTester, and their email address will be, Anthony, let's use your email address, Anthony at John Miller realestate.com. And your role is going to be that of the buyer, okay?
Sure.
And I'll click Add Person, but your name is going to be Testy McTester. And there it is, the people in the person in the folder. So now what you do is, now that you've added a person and you've chosen their role on the right hand side, we'll start with the contract to purchase. And you see here it gives you another option to select a person for those roles. So if you had buyer 1 and buyer 2, you can do that. And just click Assign. And if you had the seller's name, you could do that too. So you see what happens here on the top left-hand corner. It automatically puts in the person's name on the top left. And you could also have their address if you wanted to by entering it in the section we were just in where you add people. So, contract to purchase real estate. What we're going to do here is, I just want to expand this screen a bit. over here, if you know the owner's name, you can type it in here. If not, you can just put owner of record. And you could go into MLS if you wanted to, and let's say this was the property you were writing an offer on. You could go to public records and see the person's name here of the offer that you're writing up on, and copy and paste their name right into the offer itself if you wanted to, if that were the seller. Okay?
Yep.
See how we did that?
Right.
And so the buyer offers to purchase the real property described as, and quite simply, this is where you put the address. So you could go here and just copy and paste that here if you wanted to. Now let's say that's the address. Together with the buildings and improvements thereon to which I have been introduced by. And if, let's say, Anthony, you're the buyer agent in this case, okay?
Yeah.
So as the buyer's agent, you put Anthony. Did I spell your name right?
Sorrentino.
Perfect. Okay. And then over here, what you'd want to do is, you're the agent. However, the broker is Keller Williams Realty. Okay.
Right.
Purchase price. So you put the purchase price in here, and let's say that this property you're putting in an offer for $850,000. Pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
Now, the deposit, as a deposit to bind this offer, this is often referred to as your initial deposit also. So what you would do here is you would type in what the initial deposit is. Now, in regard to the initial deposit, any offer is considered a binding offer as long as it has consideration. This initial deposit, years ago, what we used to do is we'd submit an offer to the listing agent, and we would put it in their hand. We would physically drive the offer and bring a check and attach the check to the offer with a paper clip, and we put it in an envelope and we'd hand deliver it to the office. And the reason we would do this is that an offer is not a legally binding offer unless it has consideration, which technically means that you could write up an offer, make a photocopy of a check or scan a copy of a check, send it over to the agent via email or through DotLoop. And unless that agent has the check, another offer could come in and they could, negotiate that other offer. In other words, here's what you don't want to have happen. You don't want to be the agent that submits an offer, everything looks great, they accept it verbally on a Friday night at 8 o'clock. And the listing agent says, Anthony, I'm busy, I'm going out to dinner with my spouse. You can get me the check tomorrow. Well, let's say Saturday morning another offer comes in. Well, the seller can accept that other offer if they want to. In other words, what you're doing by not giving the agent the check, you're giving that agent an opportunity to say, we don't have a legally binding offer because a legally binding offer has to have consideration and we don't have your check. If it's my listing, I do not send a copy of the signed offer to the buyer agent or the buyer until we have the actual physical check in our office. That's a hard and fast rule. And when a buyer agent says, well, why do you do that? Why can't I just mail it to you? I said, well, you can mail it to me, but you will not get a copy of the signed offer until I have the check. Imagine this. It's your listing. You have a buyer that goes and let's say you have a buyer that puts an offer in on a property. You don't get the check. and the agent says to you, "Oh, I'll give you I'll mail it to you." They don't mail it to you. It's, "Oh, I'll give it to you the home inspection." They show up the home inspection. They don't give you the check. At the home inspection, they want to withdraw their offer. So the seller says, "Well, I don't want to give them their deposit back." Well, guess what? You never collected a deposit. Who's the seller's attorney going to sue?
Me?
Right. And your company, and you're going to drag you through the mud. Now, it won't be good enough that you just say, "All right, I'll write the $1,000 that they should have given me. I'll just have it come out of my pocket, and you can keep the $1,000." Because an attorney may sink their teeth into that and say, "Hey, you know what? There's pain and suffering. They're my legal fees." It just goes on and on and on. So, you don't want to be on the hook for that. You don't want to take responsibility and liability for that. And that's why a listing agent should have the check and should deposit the check right after, in the time frame that I just mentioned. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So if I'm a buyer agent and I have time to do this, I'm going to hand deliver the check and the offer to the agent, as well as send it over via email as well, because I don't want to give them an excuse not to move forward with my offer. You follow me?
Yeah.
So that's my little, detail in regard to the initial deposit. So over here, what you can do as a initial deposit, people always ask, "Well, how much should I put down as a deposit?" Well, customarily and traditionally, it's usually $1,000. Or it could be as low as 500. I've seen as low as 500. I've never seen it lower than 500. But it can be any amount of money that would bind the offer.
Okay.
David Leo,
However, what you want to do is you want to get your offer accepted. So let's say you're in a multiple offer situation. I had one of my good friends put down $7,000 as a deposit, initial deposit, right here in this blank.
Wow.
And so, see how you just said wow? Right?
Yep.
Well, his offer was lower than the other offers that came in. But because he had a larger initial deposit, the seller said wow, and the listing agent said wow, and they accepted his offer and not the other offer because he put more money down. And he said to me, "Well, do I get this back if I'm not happy with the home inspection?" I said, "Yes, it's subject to the home inspection." And he said, "Well, do I get this back if it doesn't appraise?" "Yes, we put a contingency in the offer saying that if it doesn't appraise, you get your deposit back." "Do I get this deposit back if I get denied financing?" "Yes, the offer is subject to you being able to get financing." "Do I get this back if the seller defaults in any way?" "Yes, you get it back." He said, "So what do I care if it's 1,000 or 10,000?" I said, "Well, you shouldn't." He said, "Okay, great. I'm going to put $7,000 as an initial deposit to try to beat out my competition." I said, "That's genius. Let's do it." And we got the offer accepted.
That makes a lot of sense.
So this doesn't have to be anything specific. So what I want to try to eliminate is anyone watching this video is that there are things that are customary, but they're not the hard and fast rules, right?
Right.
You can go beyond that and below that if you need to for any reason. It's optional, it's negotiable, and depending on what you put in here, it could hurt you or it could help your cause depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And in most cases, you're trying to get the offer accepted and the buyer wants to buy the property and get the offer accepted. So that's my take on this initial deposit right here. And then there's a second deposit that's due as an additional deposit that's due upon the execution of the purchase and sale agreement, which is traditionally 14 days after this offer is accepted, and we'll get to that in a minute. So traditionally in the past, you would take the purchase price of $850,000 and you'd multiply that times 5%, and in this case it would be $42,500. So, and then what we'd do is we'd eliminate the $1,000, which would make it $41,500.
So why did you use 5%?
It's just a number that we've used in the past, and you could use any number you want. I've seen offers where this additional deposit is another $1,000. I've seen it where it's $200 here and $500 here. Again, it doesn't make a very strong offer at all, but if you want to get your offer accepted, and traditionally, it's to answer your question, you can do any number you want in here, but traditionally, if you do anywhere between 3 to 5% of the purchase price here, and make that a total deposit between the $1,000 initial deposit and the $41,500, these two numbers added together equal 5% of this number. And you could do as low as 3%. You could do as low as 1%. It doesn't matter. Whatever the seller is willing to accept and whatever you need to do to get your offer accepted, then that's what you should put in here. You follow me on that?
Yeah.
So again, if I were advising a buyer, I would say if you have the money and to do it, that's great. Some people are doing 0% down financing. Let's say they're putting 100% financing and they are approved and are qualified for that type of loan program. Well, they can do that. However, I've seen people say, I'm going to put $100 here and I'm putting 0 down here in this section right here because we're doing 100% financing. Here's the one thing that a lot of new people, and I did this when I was new as well, I didn't understand the difference. There's a difference between a down payment and a deposit. These two numbers represent the deposit, okay? What you do for financing in a down payment is completely separate, has nothing to do with this. So traditionally what happened, and the way a lot of agents got confused with this, is that they'd be 5% down and they'd put 5% as a deposit in, but they're two entirely different things. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yeah, I do. Maybe elaborate a bit more.
Sure. So in other words, if they're putting 5% down, then at the closing, this $42,500, the combined deposits, then get converted into a down payment at the closing.
Okay.
You follow me?
Yeah.
So you could put 50% down. I put $425,000 down payment and only finance $425,000. But I've already put this amount of money right here down as a deposit, and I can apply this deposit toward my purchase price.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? So what I've said to real estate agents who have come to me when I've had a listing and they said, look, we're not putting anything down at purchase and sale because it's 100% financing. And I said, well, don't confuse a deposit with a down payment. Just because you're putting 0% down, it doesn't mean that my homeowner is, my home seller, my homeowner and seller, they're not going to take their home off the market for 6 weeks with a $100 deposit.
Right.
What seller would be comfortable doing that? And so what I explained to them is that, listen, I know that they don't have 3% or 5% as a down payment, and that's why they're using 100% financing. However, what we want to do is we want to make the seller feel comfortable. So you might put $1,000 down now and $1,000 down at purchase and sale agreement, and if you're financing 100%, well then you can have those $2,000 that you put down as a deposit. You can have that money back at closing. We just want to hold this money to make sure the buyer doesn't just walk away for no reason 3/4 of the way through the closing.
Right.
And you've had your home off the market for a month. And I often say to the buyer's agent, does that make sense? And they say, yeah, okay, I get it. So do you understand that?
Yeah, I have a question. Now I can understand the first deposit to bind this offer, putting in like 1,000 to 7,000, because, if you have that kind of out-of-pocket expense to put down to make yourself look stronger, that makes sense. However, the second part, using the 3 to 5% method on the purchase price, putting down that much, is that usually typical for someone to do that, in the sense that they are taking that $40-something thousand from the loan that they just got from that money? Because it's not usually typical. Someone's got $40-something thousand to spend and put down to make it look strong. If you get what I'm saying.
They do. They do if they're buying an $850,000 house. In other words, if you're buying an $850,000 house, you're not going to qualify for 100% financing. So you're at least going to put 5% down as a deposit. As a down payment, excuse me. You're going to at least put 5% down as a down payment on the property. So you might as well just use it as a deposit for now anyway.
Right. So it does come from their bank or their personal money. Correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, it comes right out of their checking account.
Okay. That makes sense. So is it stronger then to look better to the seller to put in like that 1 to 7,000 in the first part and then following that 3 to 5%, or is it better to maybe use a lower figure on the second part and make the first part a little higher? Does it kind of not matter so much?
It depends on. It really depends on you because you don't know what other offers are looking like. So yours might be the best. It might not be. I think what you bring up a good point, Anthony. As long as these two boxes right here together, whether you put let's say you put $41,500 in this box and then $1,000 at purchase and sale in this box. I've written offers where we've said we're going to put $42,500 right here and nothing at purchase and sale. I'm going to give you 5% up front.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yes. Yes, because the first part is up front, but the second part would be at closing, correct?
No. The second part, read this here. The second part is due upon executing the purchase and sale agreement. And we haven't gotten to this yet, but the purchase and sale agreement is typically signed after the home inspection. And the home inspection will be done traditionally anywhere between 7 to 10 days, and the purchase and sale agreement is usually somewhere in the range of about 14 days after the seller signs this offer. You follow me?
Right,
so if it's 6 weeks to close, within 2 weeks the seller is holding $42,500.
David, may you call on line one?
Then $1,000 pretty much is given right up front, and then the maybe a couple weeks later is the second part that's cashed, correct?
That's correct.
All right.
Yeah, and this is important to explain to a buyer too, so it's great you're asking me these questions. Do you understand that now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Awesome. All right, so let's jump down to, and if you look part here, the balance. So you have $850,000 purchase price. You're putting down as a deposit $42,500.
Right.
Well, what about the rest of the money? Well, the balance by banks, cashiers, treasurers, or certified check or wire transfer at time of closing. So whatever's left over between here and here, you still owe the seller $150,000. You're putting up this much up front, and the rest is coming from somewhere else. Okay?
Right.
So the duration of the offer. This offer is valid until, and let's just pick a date and time, then I'll tell you what we do traditionally here. So let's say it's 6 p.m. and we'll pick a date. And so, it's kind of interesting that it has the calendar here so you can see the date. So right now, today's the 21st of August. And so let's talk about dates and the duration of the offer. And I also want to talk about specifically who is this date for? Because there's a lot of misconceptions as to what this date is for. Let's say we'll first pick a date. So if there are multiple offers and you don't want to give them a lot of time to think about it, you pick a day from now, okay? But let's say there aren't multiple offers and you want to give them the weekend to think about it because your offer came in kind of low and you're kind of playing the game with the seller and you want to give them time to respond. And if you think that's in the seller's best interest and if you think that's in the buyer's best interest, then let's say you give them a couple of days to respond, okay? So that's in terms of the date. Now let's talk about what this date is for, okay? some people say, well, I put an expiration date of 8/24 on my offer, so your seller has to reply to me by that date. That's what they think that expiration is for. The expiration is for the buyer, not for the seller. So some agents will say, well, you have to have your seller respond by that time. What if the seller doesn't want to reply at all? The seller doesn't have to do anything they don't want to do. They don't have to even respond to this offer. They can do what they want.
Right.
So that's not what that date is for. So let's read it. It says, this offer is valid until 6 p.m. on this date, by which time a copy of this offer shall be signed by the seller, accepting this offer or return to the buyer. Otherwise, so that's option one. They can accept it just as it is, right? But they have to do it before this date. If they do it after this date, you have to go in and change this date, because if it's signed on the 25th, it was signed after the duration of the offer.
Right.
So when you change an offer, you need to change the duration of the offer as well. It's just a good practice. Otherwise, this offer shall be deemed rejected. So if the seller doesn't get back to your buyer by this date and time, the offer is deemed rejected, and the money tendered herewith shall be returned to the buyer. Make sense?
Yep.
Upon written notice to the buyer or the buyer's agent of a seller's acceptance, the accepted offer shall form a binding agreement. This is of the essence as to each provision. In other words, time is of the essence as to each provision. It's time sensitive.
Right.
So if they don't do it within this time, there's no deal. If they do it within the time, then we've got a deal.
Right.
If they sign it after this date, technically you should change this date to a date that's beyond where they signed it. Okay?
Right.
I've seen agents not do this, and everything goes through and it closes and it's fine, but you just don't want, I mean, a buyer could say, well, I'm backing out and I want my money back, and the seller says, well, why? And they say, well, I'm going on the technicality that you signed it after the duration of the offer, and so therefore it's not valid. And so technically the seller doesn't have an offer because they didn't sign it within that time frame. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Let's talk about the purchase and sale agreement. The purchase and sale agreement is, number one, it supersedes everything that's written in this offer, because it'll say that in the purchase and sale agreement. And that is an agreement that is traditionally put together by the seller's attorney. Will write a purchase and sale agreement. This is a 14-page form saying a lot of what you're saying here in 2 or 3 pages.
Okay.
And more. It's more detailed agreement. This initial deposit will be due at the signing of this purchase and sale agreement. And it should be signed, you can pick a time. Let's say it's 4 p.m. and then we'll pick a date 2 weeks out from now. So that would be the first Friday in September.
What's a typical time frame for something like the duration of the offer in purchase and sales? Like a couple days for the offer, obviously, but then purchase and sales like a couple weeks
Yes.
to show things? Or?
Yes. And there are exceptions, maybe you are the buyer or the seller is going on vacation, or it's subject to the sale of another property, and so you might have to goof around with these dates a little bit, but
Okay.
traditionally, in most cases, this is the way it would work out. Okay?
Yep.
So a couple of weeks. So now what we can do is, look at that. I just made the screen larger, so I bet anyone watching this video is saying right now, I wish you did that when you started.
Yeah.
So now you can sit back a little further and be able to still see the screen. So let's talk about the purchase and sale agreement. Execute means sign it, okay? So when it says the seller and buyer shall on or before this date execute the standard purchase and sale agreement of the Massachusetts Association of Realtors, or a substantially equivalent, which, when executed, when signed by both parties, shall become the entire agreement between the parties, and this offer shall have no further force and effect. In other words, whatever they sign in the purchase and sale agreement, it supersedes this. This is no longer in effect, this offer. Whatever they wrote in the purchase and sale, they'll change it. So sometimes there are changes to the terms, and the attorneys will say, well, we'll just put it in the purchase and sale agreement rather than you re-signing a new offer. Right. And so they'll do that. Now, I will tell you something else, and as a new agent to real estate and being new to writing offers and going through the process, it is extremely common that attorneys are late and go beyond this date, and some of them treat it very casually, where it's like, it's okay, we're still moving forward. But you want to, press the issue and make sure you get this signed in time, because if you want to have if the property is being financed, the lender will not finance, will not send the appraiser out to the property until you have the purchase and sale signed. So the appraiser wants to see a copy of this purchase and sale agreement before they will do their appraisal. So that's why we need that to move forward.
Right.
Okay. Now let's go to the closing. The seller agrees to deliver a good and sufficient deed, conveying good and clear record and marketable title at, remember you were asking me before, like, how do I check to make sure there are no clouds on the title and on a property and all that? Well, the attorneys, the seller's attorney and the lender's attorney, someone's going to take care of this title and make sure that it's marketable. In other words, there are no liens on the property, so that they can convey the property from one party to another. Now, most closings, because financing, if it's being financing, if it's cash, you could close in less than a week if it's cash. But if it's financing, in order to go through the financing process, right now it traditionally takes a minimum of 6 weeks. I've heard of lenders being able to do it in 3 weeks. If they're pushed and they need to move quickly, they can do that, but 6 weeks is traditional. And if you need to bump it out further for so that would bring us out to September 25th. So if you needed to bump that date out further, you could do that as well. You could make it 3 months out if you needed to. What I would recommend you do as a good practice is I would recommend that you call the listing agent and say this to them before you even write up an offer. Say, I'm in the process of writing an offer on your listing. Tell me something. What is important to your seller? Tell me what are some of the important things I need to pay attention to in getting my offer accepted. And that listing agent may say to you, well, to tell you the truth, Anthony, this seller really doesn't want to close until after the holidays. And if they get an offer where they can close on January 15th, regardless of what the price is, there's probably a really good chance they're going to take it, because closing after January 15th is more important to them than the price. The listing agent may tell you that. So what are you going to do with your offer? You're going to have a different conversation with your buyer, aren't you?
Yeah.
And your offer not only might have the best price, but it also has excellent terms also. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. It kind of gives you that, that one up to help your buyer out that little bit more instead of delaying things, because maybe you found that out after you already submitted the offer, and then you're like, oh, well, now we got to go back and change something or do something.
Yes. Yep. Now you know you're writing your offer and it's in great shape, So over here, what you can do is you just type in the county that the property is in. So if the property is in Worcester, it's in Worcester County. If the town is located in a different county, you'd write it in here. Right. So the seller agrees to deliver a good and sufficient deed, conveying good and clear record and a marketable title at 4 p.m. on September 25th, 6 weeks out from the... Now let's say it takes 2 weeks for you to negotiate this offer. all your dates are going to be bumped out everywhere that you've just written on this form. So you need to bump out your purchase and sale date to 2 weeks after the offer is accepted. The duration of the offer needs to be bumped out. The closing date needs to be bumped out. You follow me? Everything
Yes.
might have to be bumped out an additional 2 weeks to make all this happen. Now, you will see offers, and some people may tell you, well, just make it easier. Just write in here within 14 days of acceptance. Well, technically, you need a date. So don't do that. Do this. It's just the best practice in writing up an offer, and I would recommend that you do it this way. Okay? Use dates. Don't say within X amount of days. Okay? It's just
Alright,
a
and
lazy way to do it.
Quickly, two things in regards of the date stuff. The closing date, is there usually a typical, like if the buyer, the seller's agent didn't tell me something like, after the holidays, and they said, well, I really don't know, they just want a quick close though, or they don't really care. I mean, is there a usual go-to, like, all right, we'll do it for a month out or 2 weeks out or longer?
Yeah.
And also, when figuring out these dates, if something has to be changed or bumped up, do you have to have your buyer re-sign or go over this with them in person again each time this happens?
You don't have to do it in person. You can use it using DotLoop like we are right now, because I can revise this form and send it to the buyer, and they can sign it electronically on their email or on their smartphone.
Okay.
And so yes, when you change the date, you have to get both parties to sign the changes, re-sign the form, or they can initial the changes on the side here.
Okay.
So
and the go-to
the go-to
closing
date, the go-to closing date, as I mentioned earlier, traditionally and typically it's 6 weeks out for a
Okay,
lender
6
to
weeks
close a
out.
loan. Okay. Now let's talk about this, Anthony. We have issues where people say, well, you should always close at the end of a month. Have you ever heard about that?
Yeah, I have.
Okay. So do you know what the benefit of closing at the end of a month is?
I thought someone told me before, but I can't remember.
So there's less money that the buyer has to come up with at the closing for their prepaid taxes and interest on the loan.
Yes. That makes sense.
And it's it could be a few $100. I don't. It could be $1,000. It's not going. Either way, the buyer isn't saving money. They have to pay that money eventually. It's just at the closing, for the closing costs, they're going to count how many days. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days worth of taxes or interest payment on the loan for the month of September. You follow me?
Yes.
And they have to pay that at the closing. So
Buyer, right?
yeah, the buyer. So it's less money to pay. Do you know what the disadvantage is closing at the end of the month? No, everyone wants to close at the end of the month. And so what happens at the registry of deeds? What happens at the mortgage company? What happens to the loan processors? What happens with the underwriting department? What happens to all the closing attorneys? What happens to the realtors? What happens with when you go to the registry of deeds and you're trying to close and you're standing in line and there are 5 people in front of you and they close at 4 o'clock on the dot?
Yep.
What's going to happen?
You may not get your chance to get in on that time that you
Right.
want to. So busy.
So you have this conversation with your buyer and let them know that, I know you've been told to close the end of the month, but there are some disadvantages of closing at the end of the month. Wouldn't it be better if your loan was the only loan they were working on to close on, the 16th instead of the end of the month on the 30th, okay? Or close on the 25th instead of the 30th, at the end of the month. So that's a pretty good point that I brought up right there. So hold on to that thought.
No, that's really good stuff.
Yeah. So the deposit should be held by, and this would typically be the listing agent traditionally. So let's say that you're working with Keller Williams Realty, and the property is listed by, ABC Realty Inc. Okay. And so they would traditionally hold the deposit as escrow agent, subject to the terms hereof. Endorsement or negotiation of this deposit by the real estate broker shall not be deemed acceptance of the terms of the offer. So just because they've accepted the deposit doesn't mean they've accepted the offer. In the event of any disagreement between the parties concerning to whom escrowed funds should be paid, the escrow agent may retain said deposit pending written instructions. Now, key in on this, mutually given by the buyer and the seller. So what this means is that ABC Realty will hold the deposit until both the buyer and the seller agree in writing what is going to happen with the deposit.
Okay.
So if the buyer wants to back out because they changed their mind and the seller says, well, I'm not backing out of this offer, you need to follow through with it or I'm keeping your deposit. And the buyer says, well, I'm not letting you keep my deposit and I'm backing out. So neither the seller or the buyer can get that money until they both agree as to who's going to get the money and what's going to happen to it.
Right.
So one of the two parties may have to hire a lawyer to help them get their deposit back, or get the buyer get the deposit back, or the seller retain the deposit from the buyer. So if they can't agree, then they have to handle it legally. And usually the cost of handling it legally may exceed the total amount of the deposit.
Right.
And at some point, if a real estate company is holding on to a deposit for so many years, I forget the length of time now, they actually are required to turn that money over to the state of Massachusetts.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know, again, how many years it is. Maybe it's 3 years, 7 years, whatever. But if you're holding on to a deposit and neither of the two parties agreed on who's going to get it, then what happens? No one gets it. The state gets it.
Right.
And sometimes a seller may say, I'm not going to hire an attorney because I don't want to spend $1,000 to get $1,000. I'm just not going to sign what we call a release of escrow form. And they both, traditionally, they would both have to sign the release of escrow form in order to have the deposit go one way or the other. Moving on, it says the escrow agent shall abide by any court decision concerning to whom the funds shall be paid and shall not be made a party to a pending lawsuit solely as a result of holding escrowed funds. Should the escrow agent be made a party in violation of this paragraph, the escrow agent shall be dismissed, and the party asserting a claim against the escrow agent shall pay the agent's reasonable attorney's fees and costs. Moving on to number 6, contingencies. It is agreed that the buyer's obligation under this offer and any purchase and sale agreement signed pursuant to this offer are expressly conditioned upon the following terms and conditions. So here are a list of contingencies. Contingency number 1 is A, mortgage. Contingency number 2 is B, inspections. You can add additional contingencies down here at the bottom. One contingency that we see a lot now is, it's subject to the property appraising at or above the appraisal price, right?
Right.
So here we are, the mortgage. It's contingent. If it's cash, what I like to do is I like to take in big bold letters. I use this program called PDF Escape, and you just go to www.pdfescape.com, and you can take a PDF and write on top of it in huge letters, waived, right over the whole paragraph.
Oh, okay.
It just really looks awesome when you put that in front of a listing agent and or a buyer, or you could do the same thing with inspections. If the buyer is not going to do inspections because they're in a competitive situation and they want to get the property and they're not worried about the condition of the property, they're comfortable moving forward, they don't have to do a home inspection. So they can delete it, and they can waive the home inspection if they want, and you could just write right across the top of here waived, or write delete, whichever you want. What I've done is I've taken a line and I've drawn it on an angle. Like I'll start here and draw a line across the top, like a big X through it, and write delete. Just really make it look awesome. It really brings it to the surface and makes your offer stand out. So the mortgage, the buyer's obligation to purchase is conditioned upon obtaining a written commitment for financing in the amount of X amount of dollars. So let's pretend, Anthony, that this buyer is putting down 20%. So in this price range, typically you're going to see someone put down 20% or more. So $850,000 times 20% is $170,000 that they're putting down. And let's see.
From their mortgage, correct?
Yep. So let's see.
That's what we're talking about. So it's not coming from their personal expenses, right? Obviously.
Yes, it is. So
It is.
well, follow me on this. So the mortgage amount is going to be $680,000. And they've already put down $42,500 as a deposit. So they're going to, at the closing, they're going to take the $42,500. And if you add that, let me do it on the calculator, $42,500 plus the mortgage company is going to bring a check for $680,000. So that's a total, if you add the 680 plus the 1,000 plus the 4,250 that they already paid, there's a balance there of let's see, so 850,000 minus 42,500, 850,000 minus 42,500 for the deposit, which will be the deposit going to be applied to the purchase price at the closing. You have a balance of $807,500 that's owed to the seller. The mortgage company is going to write a check to the seller for $680,000.
Okay, yeah, coming from your mortgage that you just took
Right.
out. But it's not from like a checking account, obviously.
It's from the mortgage company, right?
Right, exactly, okay.
So it could be wired or wired the funds right directly to the seller's account. So now the balance is $127,500. So when you take $850 minus $42,500 for your deposit that's applied to your purchase price, plus you're putting 20% down as a down payment on the property, and you're borrowing $680,000. When you deduct that, you have a balance of $127,500. So at the closing, prior to the closing, the buyer's attorney will the lender's attorney will put the HUD together, and the buyer's attorney will reach out to them. They'll communicate with each other, and they will tell the buyer, this is how much money you have to bring to the closing. So part of that, to satisfy the loan obligation, they would have to come up with $127,500. Okay?
Okay, so they have to pay at closing from their own pocket the $127,000 plus dollars, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And additional closing costs, prepaid interest on the mortgage. They'll have to prepay 1 year's worth of their homeowner's insurance and any other fees and dues,
Right.
So they spell it out in the HUD statement for the buyer. Okay. Now, it says that you're going to, the key word we want to focus in here is the word commitment. So, commitment. The buyer's obligation to purchase is conditioned upon obtaining a written commitment for financing in the amount of $680,000 at prevailing rates, terms and conditions by, and there's a date that goes in here. And unfortunately, there's no date drop down in this box. And so, traditionally, it usually takes 30 days to get a commitment from the time that the offer is signed. So let's say we go out to, the closing is on the 25th, and so that's 6 weeks out. So September 11th would be 30 days from now. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks. So it would be 4 weeks. Oh, okay. So I should move the closing date out another week. So it'd be September 18th would be the commitment date that would be realistic. Okay, so we just moved that out to 6 weeks from today, and then we're going to move this out until September 18th. Is that what I said?
Yeah.
18th. Because it takes about that long for a lender to get a commitment for the mortgage. So these are the steps of things you have to be concerned about in terms of going through the entire process. The first step is you have the initial deposit. The next milestone is the home inspection, which you'll see right here, which is typically done within 7 to 10 days. Again, if you're a competitive situation, you want to try to do it sooner than later. So if you can do it in 5 days, do 5 days. In 10 days, 10 days. Because what you're doing is you're asking the seller to wait all these amount of days before you get back to them and tell them whether you want to buy the property or not. So
Right.
the sooner you can do this, the better it looks for the seller. The more excited the seller is. They want to know now, not later.
Right.
That's your first hurdle. The next hurdle is getting the purchase and sale agreement signed within 14 days. The hurdle after that is the appraisal, which is done anywhere between the purchase and sale agreement and the commitment on the mortgage, and that will and once that's done, once you have an appraisal and the lenders do everything that they need to do to get the commitment for the mortgage by this date, then that's the next date you have to pay attention to. And once you get the commitment for the mortgage, everyone in the transaction can breathe a lot easier at that point. But up until that point, you have to really, do everything you can to make sure everyone's doing what they can to make everything happen.
Right.
So the buyer shall have an obligation to act reasonably, diligently, to satisfy any condition within the buyer's control. If despite all reasonable efforts, the buyer has been unable to obtain such written commitment, the buyer may terminate this agreement by giving written notice that is received by 5 p.m. on the calendar day of that date set forth above, September 18th. In the event that notice has not been received, this condition is deemed waived. In the event that, in other words, if this date goes by and your buyer does not submit in writing that they've been denied financing and they want a return of their deposit, if the buyer's attorney or you do not submit that to the listing agent and the seller by that date, then this condition is waived. You can no longer, you've passed the date. Sometimes you might need to extend that date because the lender, and you get an extension form signed by both parties because the lender can't get the commitment done by that date. But make sure you have that condition, that extension signed, because if you don't, then the condition is waived. So in the event that due notice has been received, the obligations of the parties shall cease and this agreement shall be void. All monies deposited by the buyer shall be returned. So the buyer gets their deposit back if they don't get the commitment by this date and you have given them written notice. Okay? In no event shall the buyer be deemed to have used reasonable efforts to obtain financing unless the buyer has submitted one application by a certain date and acted reasonably, promptly, in providing additional information requested by the mortgage lender. So this date, to apply for financing, you could have a buyer that says, well, I've already applied for financing. All I have to do is find a house. And if they have formally put in an application that's subject to them getting a purchase and sale signed, you could say, done, already done it. Or if they haven't formally applied yet and they're waiting to find a home first before they can apply, they should apply within 5 days. So sometimes you'll see people write within 5 days, and so I don't do that. I look at a calendar and I say, okay, what's 5 days from now, and let's say if this offer gets accepted, by the 26th, I'll apply for financing on September 1st, let's say. Give me 3 to 5 days to apply for financing. I'll go around, I'll check interest rates, talk to a few people, and see who I want to apply with. So,
however, if I've already pre-approved my buyer and they're already talking to a mortgage lender.
Pre-approval is different than applying. So
Okay.
they have to fill out an application.
Okay, so then the person that they originally got pre-approved by, after you set that date of 5 days out, they have to talk to that person that I set them up with within that 5 days to get the actual approval.
Have to fill out an application.
Right, okay.
Yes. Yep.
Gotcha.
They have to apply by that date. Now, if the listing agent says, hey, your buyer's supposed to apply for financing by September 1st, have they done that, and can you prove it? You have to be able to prove it by that date, or the buyer is running the risk of having this. In other words, if you can't prove that they applied by September 15th, it says right here, in no event shall the buyer be deemed to have used reasonable efforts. See? If they wait until September 17th to apply for financing, then, they haven't really given themselves enough time to do that. You see what I'm saying? They should apply right away.
Right.
So that's important. So this is typically within, 3 to 5 days for applying. This is typically 30 days from, this is usually 3 to 5 days or 1 day or 2 days from the offer being accepted.
Okay.
And this date is typically 30 days out from the offer being accepted, right here.
Okay. That helps out.
Yep.
That's good.
Inspections, typically 10 days. 7 to 10 days is what I've seen. Again, if you want to really make your offer look good, make it 5 days, 3 days. If you really want to make your offer, if you want the seller or the listing agent to get excited, don't make it subject to a home inspection at all.
Right.
I've seen buyer agents and buyers say to
Listing agents?
buyers. I've seen buyer agents and I've seen buyer agents say to buyers, well, you have to do a home inspection and you have to do it within this time frame. They don't have to do a home inspection. Should you do one? Yeah, it's probably a good idea. You don't know if the house is falling or not. So, if you want to make sure that the house is okay, yeah, do it. If you're confident that the house is okay, the buyer is confident, then they should do one. Then they don't have to do one.
Right.
It's not mandatory. It's not mandatory. It's just recommended. The buyer's obligation under this agreement are subject to the right to obtain inspections of the premises or any aspect thereof, including but not limited to home, right? Look at this. Home, pest, radon, lead paint, mold, septic, sewer, water quality, and water drainage by consultants regularly in the business of conducting said inspections. So this is arguable. It could be a contractor. It doesn't need to be a certified, licensed home inspector who's a member of ASHI. It just says consultants regularly in the business. You could have a cousin who's a contractor do these inspections.
Oh.
It says of the buyer's own choosing and at the buyer's sole cost within blank amount of days after seller's acceptance of this agreement. Now, if you can't get all your inspections done within this time frame, then you need to get an extension signed getting permission from the seller to do this. If you have the inspection done on the 10th day and you need 2 more days to get the results back for a radon test, you need to extend the date for the inspections. But let's read on and see how this offer reads before we get into that. If the results are not satisfactory to the buyer, in the buyer's sole discretion. It's the buyer's opinion whether or not it's to their satisfaction or not. It doesn't matter. It says, well, the roof isn't, a listing agent or the seller doesn't have the right to come back and say, oh, well, it's not that bad. Well, it could be that bad to the buyer, and that's the buyer's discretion to determine whether it's that bad or not. The buyer shall have the right to give written notice received by the seller or the seller's agent by 5:00 p.m. on the calendar day after the date set forth above. So go on your calendar, go 10 days out from today, right? You have 24 hours from that date to get back to them with any issues or problems that you have. You follow me?
Yeah.
So it's not 48 hours, because there's another offer that's out there that says within 48 hours. It doesn't say that. So it says by 5 p.m. on the calendar day after the date set forth above, terminating this agreement. Upon receipt of such notice, this agreement shall be void, and all monies deposited by the buyer shall be returned. Failure to provide timely notice of termination shall constitute a waiver. In the event that the buyer does not exercise the right to have such inspections or to so terminate, the seller and the listing broker are each released from claims related to the condition of the premises that the buyers or the buyer's consultants could reasonably have discovered. So you're just, if this isn't done by this date, they're waiving their rights to the inspection, and they're waiving their right to get their deposit back because they're not happy with their inspection result. So again, time is of the essence here. You have to get these things done within a certain time frame. And if you don't, if you come back 48 hours or 25 hours after that date, 10 days after this offer is accepted, you don't have any recourse. And the seller can, and the listing agent can tell you to go pound sand.
Yeah.
In some cases, if you're running behind by, and you didn't, the seller still wants to sell, the listing agent still wants you to, your buyer to buy the property, the buyer still wants to buy the property, and, and the transaction just happens. Some real estate brokers get lulled into a sense of false security because they've just closed 10 transactions this year, and all 10 of them had home inspections that were negotiated outside of the dates. All 10 of them had purchase and sale agreements that were not signed on time. All 10 of them, the commitment was not issued on time. No one ever filed an extension or agreement, and it closed on time or later. And they just start saying, all right, well, these dates don't really matter. It's going to close anyway. Don't worry about it. And then the 11th transaction comes along and someone says, hey, wait a minute. No, you didn't do this by this date, so I'm backing out. And then the deal falls apart.
Right.
So my caution to all of you watching this video is that don't get lulled into a false sense of security that these dates don't matter. They do, and they will probably matter the most when it means the most. So pay attention to them and handle them effectively. Representations and acknowledgments, we'll read through this one here. The buyer acknowledges receipt of an agency disclosure, a lead paint disclosure for residences built before 1978. The home inspector's fact for consumers brochure, prepared by the Office of Consumers Affairs. So we have to get that to the buyer as well. The buyer is not relying upon any representation, verbal or written, from any real estate broker or licensee concerning legal use. Any reference to the category, single-family, multifamily, residential, commercial, or the use of this property in any advertisement or listing sheet, including the number of units, number of rooms, or other classification, is not a representation concerning legal use or compliance with zoning bylaws, building code, sanitary code, or other public or private restrictions by the broker. So what advice would you give a buyer if they're signing this offer that says this? Well, they should go find out that anything that's in that listing sheet, or that the listing agent or the seller is saying, they need to go and confirm through their own due diligence to find out. Go to the town hall, go to the Board of Health, go to the assessor's department, and find out that any and all of these things are true.
Right.
And that they're accurate. The buyer understands that if this information is important to the buyer, and it should be, of course, it is the duty of the buyer to seek advice from an attorney or written confirmation from the municipality. It doesn't say that the buyer has the duty to get it from the real estate broker.
Right.
You, as the real estate broker, should be the source of the source. You should tell them where to go to get the information. You should not get the information for them and give it to them, because wherever you got the information from, if it was inaccurate and you gave that to the buyer, you've just misrepresented something to the buyer.
Right.
And you don't want to be on the hook for that. Let's say you go to the assessor's department or the building department and they say, oh yeah, that's zoned for multifamily, that's no problem. And you found out that information from someone who it was their first day on the job and they mixed it up between another property. They made a mistake. You went back to the buyer and told the buyer, hey, you're all set, it's a multifamily, you're good to go. They buy the property and they go to sell it 3 years from now.
Yep.
They find out it's not a multifamily property, but you said it was, Anthony. In fact, I still have your email that you said it was. You misrepresented this property to me. Who's on the hook now?
Me.
Yay. Okay, so you don't want to be that guy.
Yep.
You want to tell them where to go to get the information. That's giving. And some agents say, well, I want to give my buyers good service. I want to give them good service. Well, you're not giving them good service by doing that. That's not
Right.
You're not helping them. You need.
Out of our reach, out of our jurisdiction, we can't know things.
It's
like
not
that.
part of your job, to
Right.
do that. Your job is to find them a property, negotiate the best price and terms, get them the house is the number one priority as well. Because the buyer, like in my case, I didn't care about the price of a property. I was willing to pay fair market value or more for it. I just wanted to get the property because it was the only one available of its kind, and I needed to move in that town within a certain time frame to get the kids in school and blah, blah, blah. So if you want to do a good job for me as my buyer's agent, then you need to just get me this house, period, by any means necessary. So what should I do? And then you can give them options of what they can do to get the property. Too many agents who work as, quote, buyer agents, unquote, focus way too much that their job is to beat the seller up on the price, and in reality, in doing that, they end up not getting the house for the buyer, and now the buyer's bummed out. So let's pick up where we left off where the cursor is right here. It says, in addition, the buyer acknowledges that there are no warranties or representations made by the seller or any broker on which buyer relies in making this offer, except those previously made in writing and the following. If none, write none. And 98% of the time, it's usually none, and so you write none in there. So if you go in MLS right here, guys, and you click on the property and you see this little tab up here where there are some additional documents, and you pull down and let's say there are some warranties or representations on the property that they're making. Like here's a lead paint disclosure form, or you may see seller's description of property in here. Open it up and see that they are making a warranty and a representation on the property. And where if you see that in MLS or that the agent or at the property, we're warranting that there were carpenter ants and we have a 12-month warranty that you'll never see another carpenter ant in here again. So if there are any exceptions, then you would write them in this section right here, but it's pretty rare you're going to find those. So pay attention here. We need to get the buyer the agency disclosure form, the lead paint disclosure, and the home inspector's fact for consumers brochure prepared by the office. So those three things need to go to the buyer when they're signing. They're confirming that they've received them by signing this here. Number 8, buyer's default. If the buyer defaults in buyer's obligations, all monies tendered as a deposit shall be paid to the seller as liquidated damages and shall be the seller's sole remedy. So in other words, the seller can't do anything above and beyond that by saying that it's their sole remedy. They can try, but they did just sign a contract saying that their only remedy to a situation is to keep the deposit, not do something more than that, like maybe sue them for more money above and beyond what the deposit is. Right. And so the deposit now is how much? $42,500. Okay, so in here there are additional terms. Here you can write things like, subject to any number of things, appraisal.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to type it all out, but you could say subject to property appraising for at or above the purchase price. If it doesn't appraise, then we can withdraw the offer. You could write in subject to seller leaving the refrigerator and all of the curtains.
Okay, so it's everything from stuff like that, curtains and refrigerator, to we want the roof check because we saw a leak or something.
Yeah, well, that would fit under the home inspection category. But you could say subject to satisfactory review of condo documents, subject to satisfactory review of the seller's description of property that they haven't filled out yet, subject to water quality test, subject to seller obtaining Title V certificate of compliance for their septic system, subject to the seller providing a home warranty for the buyer, because they mentioned that in MLS that it includes a home warranty. You follow me?
Yeah, so typically though, is this a section that you would kind of ask your buyer and say, well, what do you think we should look for, or is this, or do you have like any go-tos, like, oh, you should automatically always recommend that we write this is subjected to in here or something?
Well, I just mentioned a list of things that they could do, so you can make note of all the things that I just mentioned. The other thing you could do is subject to satisfactory walkthrough inspection within 24 hours prior to closing. Subject to satisfactory walkthrough inspection within 24 hours prior to closing. One time, this is a very common thing that you see. It's oftentimes written in the purchase and sale agreement. And instead of saying within 24 hours, one agent submitted an offer on one of my listings that said prior to 24 hours. And I didn't pick up on that, and neither did anyone else. And the buyer agent said, well, listen, it's 25 hours prior to the closing. We're going to do the walkthrough inspection right now. And we said, well, wait a minute, it's within 24 hours. We still have time to move out. And he said, no, you don't. You need to be fully moved out and everything be in, it said in the offer, everything to be in broom swept condition and all of seller's belongings removed prior to 24 hours, with 24 hours prior to closing. And we were like, oh, wow, okay, we didn't pick up on that. And so we weren't ready. In other words, they wanted to go into the house a day before the closing, a full day before the closing, and have everything cleaned out in broom swept condition is another term you see often used, which means all the personal belongings are physically removed from the property and it's all cleaned out. And they wanted to inspect that a day before, which was really a great idea. It was very smart for them to do that.
So, what is your go-to things? Like what? Because you could, like you
I just mentioned all of them. Everything that I just said.
You always put in there.
Well, depends on how pushy you want to get with your offer.
Right. Okay. So that's the other thing too. I guess if you put more stuff and you seem picky, then they could scare the seller away and say, well,
right.
Forget them.
Right. But it's something that's really important to the buyer, and of course. Now, keep in mind, a lot of these things that I mentioned will be covered in the purchase and sale agreement. You want to make sure that they are. However, you're right. I mean, let's say that I'm in a competitive situation and I want to get this property. Under additional terms, I might just write none.
Right.
Look how awesome I am for a buyer. Like, I just want the place, Yep, you want to leave your paint cans in the basement? I don't care. I'll get rid of them after I move in. You know what I mean? I just want the house. But it also depends on what market you're in. If you're in a very strong seller's market, you don't have a lot of leverage to put a lot of things in here, because they may just tell you to go jump in the lake. But if you are in a very strong buyer's market, you could list a whole bunch of things in here and do whatever you want. Subject to, you could say subject to the seller leaving their dog. I'm joking. Don't do that.
Yeah, let's not do that. Yeah. That's a little extreme.
But you get my point, right? So at the end of this, the buyer will get this as an email, and when the buyer gets this email, they're able to click here where their name is, click on their name underneath it, and the offer gets accepted. So if like in other words, so there's two spots where the buyer can sign here, okay? Two buyers, I should say. I just put in one buyer. So they click on it and they sign the offer. This gets emailed to them, and I'll share with you in a minute how that works. But let's move on to the offer. We'll stick to that, and we'll talk about using DotLoop later. So the seller's reply. The seller can accept, reject, or reject and make a counteroffer. So if the seller makes a counteroffer, technically, if they make it in writing and the counteroffer shall expire on, they put a new expiration date in here, and the seller signs it saying they're rejecting the offer here, and they write in what their counter is, it might be the price or whatever, then the buyer can then sign the counteroffer, and the buyer can say, I've accepted the seller's counteroffer. And so technically every counteroffer should be in writing. If you were to be trained properly and advised properly on how to handle a real estate negotiation, it should be all done in writing, because the seller can change their mind if it's not in writing.
Right.
And then you're just going back and forth verbally. I will tell you that 95% of the time you are negotiating verbally back and forth or through email. And as a best practice, I would definitely put it in writing. And if you have a listing agent that prefers to do everything on the phone, you just put it in writing yourself and keep notes on everything each party said each way, back and forth, so you have it in writing. So you've confirmed it. There could be negotiations that go on for a week with details going back and forth before they get accepted.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at next, is how typical, especially if you're trying to do it the right way and get it in writing, how typical is it to, go back and forth? I mean, does this usually, especially thinking as if it's in writing, not verbally, how long does it typically go on for? And you just answered my question. It could go on for a week or more. So it could
be an hour too. It could be very short and sweet. It could be no problem.
Okay. So
yeah. And so under here, if you've hand delivered the check to the listing agent, here's their acknowledgement that they've received your offer, your deposit check, I should say. Okay. I hereby acknowledge receipt of the deposit in the amount of $1,000 from the buyer this whatever date it is, and they put, they can click on the date if you've hand delivered it. That agent who represents you can add them as a person in your loop also, and they can sign it as well here. And that's the offer. Okay? An offer is not an offer unless it has consideration, a deposit, and it's executed and signed by both parties. It doesn't matter that they verbally told you they were going to accept your offer. It means nothing until this thing is signed by both parties.
Right.
And they have your check. So make sure you get those things done. Okay?
Makes sense.
So I'm going to save this. I'm not going to save and share it. I'm going to save it. And then I'll go back to the loop. And I have my other forms I need to sign. The Massachusetts Mandatory Agency Disclosure Form. And in here, I'll check off that I'm a buyer's agent if I'm working with the buyer. You print in here, you type in Keller Williams Realty Westboro, And
Okay.
the license number, I don't know it off the top of my head, so we'd have to get the license number for Keller Williams Realty Westboro. And you would check off this box here, which states that only the real estate agent listed below, which is going to be your name here, represents the consumer named in this form. And over here, to sign your name, both you and the buyer. So when the buyer gets this and you share this file with them, they're going to open this up on their email, and they're going to hover over their name and click sign now, and they say adopt and sign, and their electronic signature goes in here. Now, if the listing agent gives you the email address for the seller, you can send these forms to the seller too, and the seller can sign this by clicking on their name. Or you can send this to the listing agent, and they can share the document with the seller and have the seller sign it, just the way I did right now. No one has to print anything. No one has to scan anything. No one has to get out of their pajamas and drive down to a real estate office somewhere. I mean, this can all be done as easily as I've done it just now, and it's perfectly legal.
And where do their signatures go, in the same spot or below?
Yeah, it
Or
says
is
right
only
here.
one person?
Right here.
Okay.
Signature of
Okay.
consumer. Yeah,
Okay.
here and here. And their name, and the date already gets plugged in here on the side. See the date right here?
Yeah.
So this doesn't this will, you know. So over here,
the
you're
buyer and the seller sign that, correct?
nope.
Who signs it then besides me?
Your buyer,
It's my buyer. Okay.
not the seller.
Gotcha.
You put your license number in here also.
Gotcha.
Okay. And what you can do is you can call DotLoop and have them set it up so that automatically your license number goes in here every time you do one of these forms. Automatically your company name and your company's license number goes in here every time you fill out one of these forms. So you can actually make a template where this gets pre-filled in automatically every time you log into it.
That's good.
So this is a disclosure form between you and the buyer. And the listing agent will more than likely have one signed between them and the seller. You do not have to share this with. You should share this with the listing agent to put everyone on notice that you are representing the buyer. And this next page, it actually goes through and explains what a seller's agent, buyer's agent, non-agent facilitator is, designated sellers and buyer's agent, and a dual agent. So this isn't a class or a video on what all of these mean. So I highly recommend that you definitely read what these are. They're very easy to understand. Just read them. If you don't get it the first time, read it again. If you still have questions, let me know, or attend a class on agency and or watch a video on what all of these mean and what it means to you and your client, because you may need to explain these at some point to a buyer. Okay? So that's that
Makes
form.
sense.
I'll save that form. I'll go back to my loop. I go to the other form. Buyer agent. Listing agent. If you add the listing agent and the sellers in here, you can do that also, but you'll need their email addresses. And again, it gets auto-filled in with the buyer and the seller's name because we put that on a previous form. And the buyer can sign it, you sign it, all of the seller signs it, you sign it. This is a waiver. It's not saying, well, let's read it together. Radon gas and mold contaminants may exist in the property of which the broker agent is unaware. Radon is an invisible and odorless gaseous radioactive element. Mold is a general term for visible growth of fungus. Whether it is visibly directly or is visibly when barriers, such as building components, for example, walls or furnishings, or example, carpets, are removed. Buyers are encouraged to obtain the services of a qualified and experienced professional to conduct inspections and tests regarding radon mold prior to closing. The waiver is that the buyers agree to hold the broker agent harmless in the event any radon gas or mold contaminants are discovered on the property. the broker slash the agents, plural, right,
Yep.
agree that in the event radon gas or mold-like contamination is discovered, this condition will be immediately reported to the buyers. So if the seller's agent knows about mold or radon, they're agreeing that they're going to tell the buyer.
They don't know necessarily either, too, right? Most times.
What's that?
They won't know necessarily most of the time. If
They
there
won't.
is, correct?
They won't. But if they do, they have to disclose it.
Right. Yeah.
And so the receipt copy, the buyers have read this radon gas mold waiver and their signatures here and acknowledge receipt of the copy thereof. Legal advice. Buyer acknowledges that this waiver does not attempt to offer legal advice. If not understood, consult an attorney. So basically we're covering our butts here and saying that, listen, we're not mold and radon experts and we don't know if there is or not, and you should be, we're advising you to get an expert to find out about it, okay? That's
So
what this form's about.
they are signing that regardless if they're doing an inspection or not, correct?
Correct.
Gotcha.
So that needs to be in the file.
Makes sense.
The last one here is pick out the buyer's name. You can do the listing agent, your name. You sign it. And this goes on, and if the home was built before 1978, then this should be accompanied with your offer. And you move all the way down is some very, very good and awesome and powerful and valuable information here that you as a real estate broker should read. I know agents who have been in the business for years have never read this form. It's horrible, but they need to read it so they understand it. And a buyer should read this as well.
Right. Now, if the home was built after 1978, we don't have to give this to them or show this to them?
Correct. I do it anyway because my thought is that what if someone brought lead paint into the house that was built in 1979?
That's true. That is a good point. I mean, you don't really truly know until you know.
Right.
So,
Until you have it inspected.
Right, yeah. So
this goes through, and when you get to page 11, I have a lot to say about this form, so if you're falling asleep, everyone, pay attention now. Wake up. This is important because I can tell you that more than 50% of the real estate brokers out there will fill out this form incorrectly. Okay? And so let's go through how it needs to be filled out properly. Seller's disclosure. Number one rule on this is that the buyer shouldn't be filling this out until the seller fills it out first. And I'll explain that in a minute. And so you should always get a lead paint form filled out by the seller first, and then your buyer goes in and fills in the blanks. However, it wouldn't hurt you to get one initialed by the buyer, acknowledging that you have verbally informed them and you've given them this form. But we'll get into that in a minute as well. So we go through seller's disclosure. The seller is going to disclose either one or two, not both. You follow me? It's either one or the other. And what does this word say right here?
check.
Check, one or two below. It does not say initial. However, you will see many people initial these boxes, and you're supposed to check one or the other, not both. So it's one or the other. Either the seller has known lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards are present in the housing and they need to explain, so either check that off, or they check this off. See, this is great that the form doesn't allow you to do both. Whoop. It's not allowed. Oh, there we go.
Oh, there you go.
Maybe it does allow you to do. Yeah, it does allow you to do both, so that's not good. The seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the housing. Okay, it's either one or the other.
Gotcha.
So let's say they know that there's lead. Now B, still working with the seller. Records and reports available to the seller. Check one. So the seller has, if the seller either has no reports, 1 or 2. Don't check both. It's either 1 or 2. If they have no knowledge of lead-based paint and they have no reports, then it is what it is.
Right.
However, if they do have knowledge of lead-based paint, they may have no reports, but they know that it's there. So they have no reports or records pertaining to it, is what they're saying. Or they do have a copy of a letter of compliance, a risk assessment report, a lead inspection report. It'll say it right on top of the report, and then they should give that to the buyer as well. Now, here's why the seller should fill this out first. The buyer, this is the buyer section right here, okay? What does the buyer need to do to this section of the form? Initial it, not check it off, okay? And there are 2 sections here that the buyers can initial. So the buyer, they don't initial all 4 of these. Sometimes I just see the initials on all 4 of them and they don't. You have to read it. So it says the purchaser or leasing purchaser has received copies of all documents checked above. Well, did the buyer get a copy of those forms or not? And if they didn't, they shouldn't initial this. Make sense?
Right, yep.
If there are no reports, like this, then why would the buyers initial this? They wouldn't, right?
Right, they
So the buyer can't really fill this out properly until the seller fills it out first. You see my point?
Yes, that makes complete sense.
The purchaser or leasee purchaser has received no documents. So the buyer either initials C or D, but never both. You understand?
Yes.
You either have the documents or you don't. So
Yeah,
you've
pretty
received them or
simple.
you haven't. It's pretty simple. Regardless of what the seller says here, they can have reports and your buyer didn't get them, then they should initial that they didn't receive them. Okay?
Right.
The purchaser or leasee purchaser has received the property transfer lead notification. By the way, that's this. Property transfer lead notification. Now, when you have this in paper form, not in the form that you see it in now, you can, it's a tear off, you know. So some agents, what they'll do is this last page is torn off. In some companies and some agents, they'll only have this page right here in their offer packet form, and they'll only have this for the buyer to sign, but they never give them the 10 pages up front because it's too many pages to copy or whatever. You don't want to be that agent. You want to make sure that they get the copies of all the forms above, and some are lazy. So if the buyer's initialing this off right here, they're saying that they've received the previous 10 pages. You follow me?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, the last one, F, is purchaser or leasee purchaser has 1 or 2 below. And what do they do in here? Check, not initial. Do not initial. Check 1 or 2, not both. So they've either received a 10-day opportunity or they're waiving the opportunity. It's one or the other. They're going to do a lead inspection or they're not going to do a lead inspection. They initial here and they check 1 or 2 below. Our transaction coordinator, Renee, chases agents all day, every day on this form, just begging them to fill it out properly. This is the most confused, misunderstood, and abused form in the real estate industry today.
Wow, that's actually surprising in a way.
Well, all you have to do is read it. I've just simplified it.
Yeah, you did.
Agent acknowledges. Initial. Agent has informed the seller. So who should initial this section?
The agent.
Listing agent, right?
Right, yeah.
Not the buyer's agent. So you can assign this box to the listing agent. This box right here, you're the buyer's agent. So you can initial this box here. It says, I verbally inform the purchaser of the possibility of dangerous levels of lead in paint, plaster, etc., etc. And who signs it? Well, the seller signs it here and here if there are 2 sellers. If there are 2 buyers, here and here. And the listing agent signs it and the buyer agent signs it. So all the parties in the transaction sign it. And the address goes in here for the property. Make sense?
Yes.
So you save that, you go back, you get the buyer to sign it first. You can do this right with you when you're in front of the buyer if you want as well, and they can do this. They can sign all these things on their phone. I'm going to share it now. All these forms will be sent to Testy McTester to their email address, and they have 8 fields that they can sign. I could make it so that they could fill in and sign if they want to change anything on the form. They can actually edit the documents before they sign them. Or if they're fine just the way they are, they can sign them, and then I can send it to multiple people. I can send it to the listing agent, the seller, the buyer. I can send it to everyone at the same time, or I can wait for the buyer to sign it first and then send it to the sellers. So, and then I just click share and done, and all of these documents just went to the buyer for their electronic signature. So that concludes how to fill out an offer and use this system, how to use DotLoop, and how to fill out an offer form.
That was